Imagine a city wrapped in fog and darkness, a place where the lights have been turned off for years. This was London in the early 1940s. The streets were gray, the buildings were broken by bombs, and the people were tired. They had been fighting a war alone, standing on an island while a great storm raged across the water. The air smelled of smoke and old brick dust. People moved quietly, heads down, clutching ration books and worrying about the next meal. Hope was a small, fragile thing, like a candle flickering in a drafty room. But then, something changed. It started as a rumble in the distance, a sound that grew louder and louder until it shook the ground. It wasn't the sound of enemy planes this time. It was the sound of boots, thousands upon thousands of them. It was the sound of laughter, loud and confident. It was the sound of music that made you want to dance even when you were hungry. Suddenly, the gray streets of London were filled with a new color. A wave of olive drab uniforms flooded the train stations and the sidewalks. They brought with them the smell of chewing gum, expensive tobacco, and strange, sweet candy. They walked with a swagger that said they owned the world. They were the Americans. They had arrived, and London would never be the same again. This is not just a story about soldiers. This is the story of two worlds colliding on a small island. This is the story of friendships, of love, of fights, and of a time when the impossible suddenly seemed possible. This is the story of the friendly invasion, that to understand what the Americans brought, we must first understand what they walked into. London before the Americans arrived was a city living in the shadows. For years, the German Air Force had dropped bombs on the city night after night. This was called the Blitz. Whole neighborhoods were turned into piles of rubble. People slept in subway stations, deep underground, just to be safe. When they came up in the morning, they checked to see if their homes were still standing. The windows of every house were covered with thick black curtains called blackout blinds. Not a single light could show at night, or the enemy planes would see it. It made the city feel like a cave. Life was very hard for the British people. Everything was rationed. This means you could only buy a very small amount of food, no matter how much money you had. An adult might get one fresh egg a week, or a small block of cheese. Meat was rare. Sugar was a luxury. People became thin and pale. Their clothes were old and patched because fabric was rationed too. There were no new toys for children, and no new cars on the roads. The mood was serious and grim. Everyone was working for the war effort. Women worked in factories making bullets. Men were away fighting in distant lands. The British people were brave and stubborn, but they were exhausted. They felt like they were holding up the sky by themselves. They needed help, but they didn't know what that help would look like or how much it would change their lives. Then came the year 1942. The United States had entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The British people heard the news on the radio. They knew the Americans were coming, but they could not imagine the scale of it. The first soldiers arrived in Northern Ireland and then moved down into England and London. They came on giant gray ships that braved the dangerous ocean. When they stepped off the trains in London, it was like a shock of electricity. These men looked different. They were taller and healthier than the British men who had been living on rations for years. Their uniforms were smart and well-tailored, made of good wool. They didn't look tired. They looked ready for anything. The arrival was chaotic and noisy. The train stations were suddenly packed with equipment. There were jeeps, which were small, boxy cars that could go anywhere. There were trucks and crates of supplies. The Americans didn't just bring themselves. They brought their whole world with them. They brought food that the British hadn't seen in years. They brought sports equipment and musical instruments. The British people watched with wide eyes. To a child in London, an American soldier looked like a movie star. They were loud, and they took up a lot of space. They didn't whisper in the polite British way. They shouted greetings across the street. They chewed gum constantly, moving their jaws in a way the British found strange but fascinating. The quiet, gray city suddenly had a heartbeat again. As the weeks went by, more and more Americans poured into London. The city became crowded. There was a famous saying that the British invented to describe the Americans. They said the Americans were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. This phrase explained the tension perfectly. The first part, overpaid, was very true. An American Private soldier earned much more money than a British soldier of the same rank. In fact, an American private could earn as much as a British captain. This caused problems. When an American soldier went to a pub, he could buy drinks for everyone. He could pay for the best seats. At the theater, he could buy taxis while British soldiers had to walk. This money difference made the British soldiers feel jealous and angry. They had been fighting a war for 3 years already. They had suffered and lost friends. Now, these new guys arrived with pockets full of cash and acted like they owned the place. The British felt that the Americans didn't understand the value of money in a war zone. The Americans would throw coins to children or tip waiters huge amounts. To the Americans, this was just being generous. To the British, it felt like showing off. The economic gap created a strange dynamic where the guests were richer than the hosts. It was like a rich cousin coming to stay with a poor family who had lost everything in a fire. The Americans brought more than just money. They brought things. Material things. London was a city of shortages, but the American bases were islands of plenty. The American soldiers, known as GIs, had access to stores called PX. In these stores, they could get cigarettes, chocolate, razor blades, soap, and nylons. These were things that British people could not find anywhere. A pair of nylon stockings was like gold to a British woman. Soap that smelled like flowers was a luxury. The Americans were generally very generous with these things. They didn't hoard them. Children were the first to benefit. American soldiers loved kids. Many of the soldiers were young themselves, and they missed their younger brothers and sisters back home. They would walk down the street and children would follow them, shouting, "Got any gum?" Chum, the soldiers almost always did. They would hand out sticks of chewing gum, bars of chocolate, and sometimes even oranges. An orange was a miracle to a British child who hadn't seen fresh fruit in years. This generosity won the hearts of the younger generation quickly. The GIs became heroes not just because they were soldiers, but because they were like Santa Claus in uniform. They brought color and sweetness to a world that was bland and gray. While the children loved the Americans, the older British people had a harder time adjusting. The cultures were very different. The British were reserved. They valued privacy and quiet. They stood in orderly lines, which they called queues, for everything. They didn't talk about their feelings to strangers. The Americans were the opposite. They were open and chatty. They would start a conversation with anyone standing next to them. They didn't understand the strict British class system. In England, a working class person spoke differently and acted differently than a rich person. The Americans didn't care about that. They treated everyone the same, which was shocking to the British. The Americans also had different table manners. They ate with the fork in their right hand. While the British used the left, they cut their meat and then switched the fork to the other hand. The British watched this with fascination and sometimes horror. The Americans were louder in public places. They laughed with their mouths open. They put their feet up on chairs. To some British people, this seemed rude and uneducated. To others, it was refreshing. It broke down the stiff social walls that had existed in London for centuries. The Americans were like a strong wind blowing through a stuffy house. They knocked things over, but they also cleared the air. One of the biggest changes happened in the evenings. Before the Americans arrived, London nights were quiet and dark because of the blackout. But the Americans wanted to have fun. They flooded into the dance halls and clubs of London. They brought their music with them. This was the era of swing and jazz. The British were used to slower, more formal ballroom dancing. The Americans introduced the jitterbug. It was fast, energetic, and athletic. They threw their partners in the air and spun them around. It was wild and exciting. The dance halls became the center of social life. Covent Garden and other famous spots were packed every night. The music was loud, played by big bands with brass instruments. For a few hours, people could forget about the bombs and the rationing. They could forget the war. The American soldiers were excellent dancers, or at least they had the confidence to try. They taught the British girls the new steps. The energy in these places was intense. It was a mixture of desperation and joy. Everyone knew that the soldiers might be sent to fight and die the next day. So they danced as hard as they could. The floorboards would shake with the rhythm of hundreds of feet moving to the beat of the swing. Music. With the dancing came romance. This was a huge part of the story. Thousands of British young women fell in love with American soldiers. The Americans were attractive for many reasons. They were polite to women, calling them ma'am and opening doors for them. They were clean and well-dressed. And of course, they had money and gifts. They could bring flowers and chocolates, things a British boyfriend simply couldn't find. But it wasn't just about the gifts. The Americans represented a different future. They talked about a land of big cars, big houses, and Hollywood movies. To a girl living in a bombed-out city, an American soldier was a ticket to a dream life. This caused a lot of heartache. British soldiers were often jealous. They felt their girlfriends were being stolen by the Yanks. There were fights in pubs and streets between British and American troops over women. But the love affairs continued. Couples would meet in parks, in cinemas, and in the blackout. They got married in rushed ceremonies. These women were called G-brides. It was a phenomenon. By the end of the war, tens of thousands of British women would leave their families to travel across the ocean to America. They were marrying men they had known for only a few weeks or months. It was a leap of faith, driven by the intensity of the war. There was a complicated and difficult side to the American arrival, and that was the issue of race. The United States in the 1940s was a segregated country. This meant that black people and white people were kept separate by law in many states. The U.S. Army was also segregated. Black soldiers served in different units from white soldiers. They had their own barracks and their own mess halls. When the American Army came to London, they brought these rules with them. But Britain was different. While Britain had its own problems with empire and race, it did not have segregation laws like the US. When black American soldiers arrived, they were often surprised by how the British treated them. The British people, for the most part, welcomed them warmly. In London pubs, a black soldier could drink at the same bar as a white person. British families invited black soldiers into their homes for tea. This shocked the white American commanders. They didn't like seeing black soldiers socializing freely with white British women. The U.S. Army tried to enforce their rules in London. They tried to designate certain pubs for black troops and certain pubs for white troops. The British landlords often resisted this. They said, "My pub is open to everyone." This caused tension between the U.S. military police and the local people. It was a strange situation where the British people often sided with the black American soldiers against the white American authorities. This racial tension sometimes exploded into violence. It wasn't just in London, but in the towns around it too. There were incidents where white American military police, or MPs, would harass black soldiers who were out having a drink. The black soldiers, who were training to fight for freedom, felt angry that they were treated like second-class citizens by their own army, especially when the locals treated them so well. There were riots and shootouts in some places. One famous incident happened in a town called Bamber Bridge, but similar feelings simmered in London. The British people watched this with confusion. They saw the Americans as the defenders of democracy, yet they saw them treating their own men poorly based on skin color. It made many British people question the American values. However, for the black G's, their time in Britain was often remembered as a time of freedom. For the first time in their lives, many of them felt treated as human beings rather than just as a color. This experience in London planted seeds that would later help grow the civil rights movement back in America. They had tasted equality in a war-torn city, and they would not forget it. As 1943 turned into 1944, the atmosphere in London changed again. The fun and the dancing continued, but the purpose became more serious. London and the whole of southern England were being turned into a massive military base. The number of soldiers grew and grew. Every park in London seemed to be filled with tents or huts. Hyde Park, the famous green space in the center of the city, was dug up to build shelters and storage areas. The streets were lined with trucks, tanks, and artillery guns. You could hardly walk down the street without bumping into a soldier. The buildings of London were taken over by the military. Old mansions became headquarters for generals. Schools became barracks. Hotels became officer clubs. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, set up his headquarters in a park near London. The city was the brain of the war effort. Maps were drawn, Plans were made and secrets were whispered in secure rooms. The British and Americans were working closer than ever. They had to coordinate millions of men and tons of supplies. The language barrier, the different habits, and the jealousies had to be set aside. They had a job to do. They were preparing for the invasion of France. Living in London at this time meant living with secrets. Everyone knew something big was coming. The soldiers knew they were training for the big show, but no one knew exactly when or where it would happen. The slogan "Careless talk costs lives" was plastered on walls everywhere. American soldiers were warned not to tell their British girlfriends anything about their training. Spies were a real fear. The city felt like a coiled spring, getting tighter and tighter. The air raids by the Germans started again too. This was the baby blitz. It wasn't as bad as 1940, but it was still deadly. Bombs fell on the crowded city. American soldiers worked alongside British firefighters to pull people from the rubble. Blood was shed together. This shared danger brought them closer. When a bomb hit a dance hall or a pub, it killed Yanks and Brits alike. They realized that the enemy didn't care about their differences. In the face of death, the arguments about money and manners seemed silly. They were brothers in arms, huddled together in the dark. The build-up to D-Day, the spring of 1944. The tension was unbearable. The south of England was so packed with equipment that people joked the island would sink if they added one more tank. The American soldiers were confined to their bases more often. They were cleaning their rifles, waterproofing their vehicles, and writing last letters home. The dance halls became a little quieter as units were moved to the coast. The romance took on a desperate quality. Weddings were rushed. Promises were made. "I'll come back for you," they said. "Wait for me." The weather was hot and dry. The dust from the convoys coated the leaves on the trees. In London, the commanders were watching the weather reports anxiously. The Channel, the strip of water between England and France, had to be calm enough for the ships. The soldiers were ready. They were fit, trained, and armed with the best weapons American factories could produce. But they were also young men, far from home, facing a terrible wall of German defense. The British people looked at them with a mixture of pity and pride. They knew many of these smiling boys would not be coming back. The Great Disappearance. In the first week of June 1944, something eerie happened. The soldiers disappeared. One day the streets were full of jeeps and uniforms, and the next day they were gone. The camps and the parks were empty. The pubs were quiet. The girls waited by the phone, but it didn't ring. The Americans had moved to the ports. They were loading onto the ships. London felt suddenly empty. It was a strange silence. The engine of the war had moved from the city to the sea. People in London waited. They listened to the radio. They watched the sky. On the morning of June 6th, the news broke. D-Day had begun. The Americans, along with the British and Canadians, had landed on the beaches of Normandy. The invasion was on. The friendly invasion of London was over. The real invasion of Europe had started. The feeling in London was a mix of relief and terror. Relief that it had finally started, and terror for the men they had come to know and love. The aftermath in London, with the soldiers gone fighting in France, London felt different. It was still the capital of the war, but the energy had shifted. The wild parties slowed down. The G-brides began the long process of paperwork to move to America. They formed clubs to support each other. They learned how to cook American food and practice the American accent. They were living in a strange limbo, no longer fully British, but not yet American. Wounded soldiers began to come back. The hospitals in London filled up. The reality of war replaced the glamour of the uniform. The Americans who returned were not the swaggering, loud boys who had arrived. They were dirty, bandaged, and possessed the 1,000-yard stare. The British people nursed them. The bond that had been formed in the dance halls was tested in the hospital wards. It held strong. The kindness the Americans had shown with their gum and chocolate was returned by the British with care and comfort. The flying bombs just when people thought the worst was over for London. A new terror arrived. The Germans began firing V-1 flying bombs. These were pilotless planes, essentially early cruise missiles. They made a buzzing sound like a giant broken lawnmower. When the engine cut out, the bomb would fall and explode. They were terrifying because they were random. American soldiers who were still in London, working in logistics or recovering from wounds, faced this new threat alongside the Londoners. Then came the V-2 rockets. These were even worse. They fell from space faster than the speed of sound. There was no warning, just an explosion. An American servicemen's club was hit one day, killing many. The shared tragedy continued until the very end. The Americans didn't just use London as a base. They bled into its soil. This shared suffering cemented the relationship between the two nations in a way that treaties and handshakes never could. The end of the war. Finally, in May 1945, the war in Europe ended. V-Day Victory in Europe Day was a massive explosion of joy. London went wild. The lights came back on. The blackout curtains were torn down and burned in bonfires. American soldiers who were in the city joined the crowds. They danced in the fountains of Trafalgar Square. They hugged strangers. The British and the Americans sang together. The relief was overwhelming, but it was also a time of goodbyes. The American army began to pack up. The jeeps were driven away. The bases were dismantled. The friendly invasion was officially ending. For the British girls who had married Americans, it was time to pack their bags. They boarded ships, often the same type of ships that had brought the soldiers, to sail to a new life in the United States. They left their parents and their homes, taking a piece of Britain with them. The empty space. When the last major units left, London felt strangely quiet. The color was gone. The chewing gum wrappers were swept away. The loud laughter was missed. The British economy was shattered, and the country faced years of rebuilding. The Americans went home to a booming economy and a victorious nation. The contrast was sharp again, but something had changed permanently. The British people had seen a different way of life. They had seen the optimism and the lack of class barriers that the Americans had. It made some British people want to change their own society. The presence of the black soldiers had started conversations about race that would continue for decades. The music had changed forever. The stiff ballroom dancing never really came back, replaced by the energy of rock and roll that would follow soon after. The children left behind. There was another legacy, one that was small and crying. Thousands of babies were born to British women with American fathers. Many of these fathers went back to the U.S. and never contacted the mothers again. Some fathers had been killed in the war. These children were a living reminder of the American presence. They grew up in London, sometimes teased for being different. Some were mixed-race children who faced difficult challenges in a mostly white society. These children carried the story of the invasion in their DNA, however. Many stories had happy endings. The war brides who moved to America built families and lives there. They became the bridge between the two countries. They wrote letters back to London, sent parcels of food during the hard post-war years, and kept the connection alive. The relationship between the U.S. and the U.K. became known as the Special Relationship, and it was built on these personal connections, not just on politics. Conclusion: the echo of boots. Looking back now, the time when American soldiers arrived in London seems like a vivid dream. It was a brief window of time, only a few years, but it changed everything. It was a time when a gray, frightened city was painted with bright American colors. It was a clash of cultures that resulted in a deep friendship. The Americans came with their swagger, their gum, and their loud voices. They annoyed the British, they charmed them, and they fought beside them. They arrived as strangers from a distant land, and they left as brothers. The legacy of that time is still written on the streets of London. It is in the memorial statues, in the graves of the fallen, and in the family trees of thousands of people. The friendly invasion proved that people from different worlds could come together for a common cause. It showed that even in the darkest times of war, there is room for dancing, for love, and for humanity. The boots of the G is no longer thunder on the pavements of London, but the echo of their arrival still rings through.